The confirmation hearing last week for the new NSA chief, the video appearance of Mr. Snowden at a tech conference in Texas, and the drip of new details about government spying have kept attention focused on an issue that many tech executives hoped would go away. Despite the tech companies' assertions that they provide information on their customers only when required under law and not knowingly through a back door, the perception that they enabled the spying program has lingered. It's clear to every single tech company that this is affecting their bottom line, said Daniel Castro, a senior analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, who predicted that the United States cloud computing industry would lose $35 billion by 2016. Forrester Research, a tech research firm, said the losses could be as high as $180 billion, or 25% of industry revenue, based on the size of the cloud computing, web hosting, and outsourcing markets in the worst case for damages. The business effect of the disclosures about the NSA is felt most in the daily conversations between tech companies with products to pitch and their wary customers. The topic of surveillance, which rarely came up before, is now the new normal in these conversations, one tech company executive put it. We're hearing from customers, especially global enterprise customers, that they're more than ever about where their content is stored and how it is used and secured, said John Frank, deputy counsel at Microsoft, which has been publicizing that it allows customers to store their data in Microsoft centers in certain countries. Isn't that sad? Isn't it sad that a great American company is having to advertise that they're storing their information in other countries because in America, we're not protecting your privacy? Isn't that sad? That a great American company, in order to stay in business, is having to advertise to their customers that we're keeping your information in another country. At the same time, Mr. Castro said, companies say they believe the federal government is only making a bad situation worse. Most of the companies in this space are very frustrated because there hasn't been any kind of response that's made it so they can go back to their customers and say, see, this is what's different now. You can trust us. In some cases, that has meant foregoing potential revenues. Though it's hard to quantify missed opportunities, American businesses are being left off some requests for proposals from foreign customers that previously would have included them, says James Staten, a cloud computing analyst at Forrester, who has read clients' requests for proposals. There are German companies, Mr. Staten said, explicitly not inviting certain American companies to join. He added, it's like, well, the very best vendor to do this is IBM, and you didn't invite them. The result has been a boon for foreign companies. Runbox, a Norwegian email service that markets itself as an alternative to American services like Gmail, says it does not comply with foreign court orders seeking personal information, reported a 34% annual increase in customers after the news of the NSA surveillance. Brazil and the European Union, which had used American undersea cables for intercontinental communication last month, decided to build their own cables between Brazil and Portugal and gave the contract to Brazilian and Spanish companies. Brazil also announced plans to abandon Microsoft Outlook for its own email system that uses Brazilian data centers. Anybody still think this bulk collection's a good idea for America? Mark Baranechea, chief executive of OpenText, Canada's largest software company, said that an anti-American attitude took root after the passage of the PATRIOT Act, the counterterrorism law passed after 9/11 that expanded powers. This is all coming from New York Times article by Claire Miller from March of 2014. But he says that the volume of the discussion has risen significantly post-Snowden. For instance, after the NSA surveillance was revealed, one of OpenText's clients, a global steel manufacturer based in Britain, demanded that its data not cross U.S. borders. Issues like privacy are more important than finding the cheapest price, said Matthias Kunitsch, a German software executive who spurned U.S. cloud computing providers for Deutsche Telekom. Because of Snowden, our customers have the perception that American companies have connections to the NSA. Security analysts say that ultimately the fallout from the revelations could mimic what happened to Huawei, the Chinese technology and telecommunications company, which was forced to abandon major acquisitions and contracts when American lawmakers claimed that the company's products contained a backdoor for the People's Liberation of China, even though this claim was never definitively verified. Silicon Valley companies have complained to government officials that federal actions are hurting American technology businesses. But companies fall silent when it comes to specifics about economic harm, whether to avoid frightening shareholders or because it is too early to produce concrete evidence. The companies need to keep the priority on the government to do something about it, but they don't have the evidence to go to the government and say billions of dollars are not coming to this country, Mr. Statton said. Some American companies say that the business hit has been minor at most. John Chambers of Cisco said in an interview that NSA disclosures had not affected Cisco's sales in a major way. Although deals in Europe and Asia have been slower to close, he said, they are still being completed, an experience echoed by other companies. Security analysts say tech companies have collectively spent millions and possibly billions of dollars adding state-of-the-art encryption features to consumer services like Google Search and Microsoft Outlook, and to the cables that link data centers at Google, Yahoo, and other companies. IBM said in January that it would spend $1.2 billion to build 15 new data centers, including in London, Hong Kong, Sydney, Australia, to lure foreign customers that are sensitive about the location of their data. Isn't it sad that companies want to avoid being in America? They want to avoid having their information cross our borders. Salesforce.com announced similar plans this month. Germany and Brazil, where it was revealed that the NSA spied on government leaders, have been particularly adversarial towards American companies and the government. Lawmakers, including in Germany, are considering legislation that would make it costly or even technically impossible for government tech companies to operate inside their borders. Yet some government officials say laws like this could have a motive other than protecting privacy. Shutting out American companies means more business for the local companies, Richard Clark, a former White House terrorism advisor, said. This is an article that was published on NPR's website. It's, as Congress haggles over PATRIOT Act, we answer 6 basic questions. A key section of the PATRIOT Act, the part of the law that the White House uses to conduct mass surveillance or bulk surveillance, the call records of Americans, is going to expire in a few days. That leaves legislators with a big decision to make. Rewrite the statute to outlaw or modify the practice, or extend the statute and let the NSA continue with bulk collection. I think it'll be interesting to see how the debate ultimately plays out. You have what's been passed in the House, the USA Freedom Act's been passed in the House overwhelmingly. The majority probably here believes that we're not collecting enough bulk data. They would prefer to collect more bulk phone data and aren't too concerned that any privacy interests are being trampled upon. So you have two sort of contrary opinions and wondering which direction we go. Some who want more collection of data, say we're not collecting enough data, say they might live with it if we add in and force the phone companies to keep the data. Right now, the bill doesn't have them keeping the data, but the concern for some of those of us who believe in privacy are that we may just be trading one form of bulk collection for another, that we may be trading a system where the government collects the data and there's a bulk collection for a system where the phone companies have the bulk collection, but you're still having the same sort of collection of data. My concern with the USA Freedom Act is that it still, I believe, may allow for a non-specific warrant. It still may allow for bulk collection in the sense that it says that you have to select a specific person, but the specific person can be a corporation. And so if you're still having a corporation, the problem is if we put the name Verizon in again, and you're getting all of Verizon's customers, and the only difference is that the phone company's holding the information and divulging it versus the government holding it, I'm not so sure we've had so much of an improvement. Some will say we just need to be safe. We just need to do whatever it takes. Doesn't matter if we give up, any kind of basic freedoms or privacy in the process. But I think we give up on who we are as a people if we say that we're going to basically at all costs, that regardless of what it takes, we're going to do this to keep ourselves safe. The thing is even the President's Privacy Commission, though, the President's Review Commission, two independent bodies, nonpartisan bodies, all ended up saying that they didn't think anybody was independently captured, that there was no unique information that was actually gotten from either of these programs, that the bulk collection of data hasn't made us safer, but it has infringed upon our privacy. I think that if we don't have a significant debate on this, if we continue to say, well, we're up against a deadline, that because there's a deadline, we don't have time for amendments, I think we run a real risk, I think, with the American people. Congress has about a 10% approval rating right now. And the thing is that some argue that might be a little bit high, considering how great a job we're doing. 10% approval rating. The vast majority of the American people think we've gone too far in the bulk collection of records. ACLU survey that we looked at a little bit earlier, between the ages of 19 and 39, over 80% of people in that age group think that we've gone too far and that we're not protecting privacy. We just listened to the article from the New York Times where they talk about what kind of business is potentially being lost because people don't want American products. I think it's kind of sad. They don't even want, not only they don't want their data held in a center in our country, they don't want their data crossing our country. I don't think we have to be that fearful of terrorism that we have to give up who we are in the process. I've met some of our young soldiers who've come back who are missing limbs. I've met the parents of some who have died. And to a person, they say that they were fighting for the Bill of Rights. They were fighting for our Constitution. And I guess it's difficult for me to understand how we can take into account their sacrifice, that they've sacrificed in war. At the same time, while we're here safe at home, we can't even protect the documents they're fighting for. I see no reason why we couldn't rely on the Constitution. I see no reason why we couldn't rely on traditional warrants. Warrants are not hard to get. Warrants are actually quite easy to get, and warrants are, if anything, very easy to get. On the FISA court, turning down a warrant is almost non-existent. So I see no reason why we couldn't try using the Constitution for a while. I am concerned, though, that the problem is bigger than just what we're talking about today. We're talking about the bulk collection of records supposedly under Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act. If we stop that, how much have we stopped? How much is still in existence? How much are we still doing through other venues? I think probably the most alarming thing that we've come across as I've been talking today is the idea that some people believe that the president has inherent powers that are not subject to Congress. That to me is very alarming. It also means that because this, I think, opinion persists within the executive branch, that there are in all likelihood many programs like the bulk collection of data, many programs that we don't know about, some that we've heard about. It's still not clear to me whether the Stellar Wind program is completely gone, which involves more than just telephone data, email, conversations, computer addresses, credit cards. What is the government collecting? How much is being collected and under what authority? But it does concern me that there are people who believe, some of them elected officials, who believe in the inherent powers of the presidency that cannot be challenged even by Congress. We've got a lot of work if that's really what we're up against. I think that it'd be a big step forward if we do something about the bulk collection of data. But I think given the court case, it's concerning to me that we might actually make the court case or the future of it moot, and that we actually could make things worse. And it wouldn't be the first time that we made things worse, thinking we were fixing things and made it worse. From the opinion of the Second Court, here are some quotes. The court writes, "The telephone metadata do not directly reveal the content of telephone calls. The fact that they do not directly reveal the content of telephone calls, however, does not vitiate privacy concerns arising out of the government's bulk collection of such data. The startling amount of detailed information metadata can reveal information that could traditionally only be obtained by examining the content." And this, I think, is a good point because, you know, many people want to downplay what metadata is or what you can determine from it. But here's the court acknowledging that you may actually get more detailed information from metadata than what you once got from the obtaining of content. And when you think about it, how true this is, think about, you know, if someone were just going to come in your house and take your papers, what can they find? You know, how many people even have personal letters anymore? People don't have anything that's on paper that's personal at all. You might have some bills. A lot of people have their bills online anymore. But it's amazing that if you put the compilation of all the metadata together, what you can determine. Remember that a high-ranking intelligence official said that we kill people based on metadata. I presume he's talking about foreigners. But the thing is that if we're killing people based on metadata, the assumption is that they can get an enormous amount of information from metadata. And we should be very careful about releasing this. They give an example of sort of metadata and what you might determine. For example, a call to a single-purpose telephone number, such as a hotline, might reveal that an individual is a victim of domestic violence or rape, a veteran, suffering from an addiction of one type or another, contemplating suicide, or reporting a crime. All just simply from metadata. Who they called, how long they spoke. Metadata can reveal civil, political, or religious affiliations. They can also reveal an individual's social status or whether he or she is involved in intimate relationships. This is still from the court case, the more metadata government collects and analyzes, furthermore, the greater the capacity such metadata to reveal ever more private and previously unascertainable information. So that's sort of the interesting thing also about metadata is we have so much online and so much information on our phone that you could probably be in someone's house for a month and never find that in paper. because we have so much that of our life revolves through phone and through things we order and phone calls and all of that, that in the old days, what could have been gotten through someone's castle, through someone's actual papers in their house, I think pales in comparison to what you can get simply through metadata, even without content. They make another point, too. Finally, as appellants point out, in today's technological world, it is virtually impossible for an ordinary citizen to avoid creating metadata about himself or herself on a regular basis simply by conducting his ordinary affairs. The order thus requires Verizon to produce call detail records every day on all telephone calls made through its systems or using its service where one or both ends of the phone call are located in the United States. To me, it's hard for me to believe that there aren't people who don't understand that what we're talking about here is a general warrant. And this is what we fought the revolution over. This is the, as John Adams said, the spark that led to the revolution. The spark that led to the revolution was the whole worry and concern, one, that soldiers were writing the warrants, and the other concern was that in writing the warrants, they weren't specific to anyone. They were being written in a general fashion, and that by writing them generally so, there could be an injustice in having an entire group that ends up being subject to a warrant that's not specific. From the appellate court, we also hear that the metadata has a far reach beyond almost imagination. In the article, as Congress haggles over PATRIOT Act, we answer 6 basic questions, which was published on npr.org. There are several questions they ask about the PATRIOT Act debate. Most of the talk has been about telephone surveillance, but the question is, what about NSA's surveillance of email and other internet activities? This congressional debate has nothing to do with any of the NSA's surveillance of internet activity. That's mostly because of the fact that these programs are authorized by different laws. The PRISM program, for example, which collects a vast amount of internet data, is covered under Section 702 of the FISA Act. Some have said that the PRISM program probably is collecting more information in many ways, maybe even dwarfing the bulk collection of the phone records. And so if we don't address Section 702 in this debate, this is also what we were talking about earlier, is the back door, the ability to say, well, we're investigating someone in a foreign country, but really they're trying to get access to someone in our country through the back door. If we don't address this, we may well not be addressing a significant part of the problem. One of the other questions is there anything else in the House bill that we should know about? The bill lifts, this is the USA Freedom Act, lifts the secrecy surrounding key decisions made by the Secret Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Corp. Going forward, some will be made public. I think this is a step in the right direction. There's a lot of legal decisions that we can, I think, discuss the pros and cons of the legal decision without having to know the specific details. And I think Senator Wyden made a good point with this earlier when he said that it's not the operational details that we need to know, but when we're questioning and debating the law, there's no reason why that shouldn't be public knowledge. One of the reasons we'd like to see the court rulings, too, is that the court itself, the FISA court, found bulk data collection constitutional. I still find this somewhat inconceivable that a court that's anything, less than a rubber stamp could find it somehow reasonable to say that collecting all of our records is somehow in advance, really, is relevant to an investigation. Because I think it's a pretty significant point that they're not going to query the data till after they get it. So there is no investigation until they've already collected the data. The other point is that when they say it's relevant, is anybody really determining that or arguing one way or the other, or do we just accept what the NSA says, that the data will be relevant? Nobody knows what will come of this debate. My hope in going on all day with this debate and trying to force the issue is try to allow for some votes on some amendments to this. We shouldn't have just an up or down vote on whether to extend the PATRIOT Act. I think when you have 80% of the population in some cases, but at least 2/3 of the entire population saying that the bulk collection of all of our phone records all of the time without a warrant is something that has gone too far and that needs to stop. I think it's an insult to the American people to think that we're not going to have any vote at all, that we would just have a vote up or down on extending this thing. I think that we really do need to have a vote, and the vote needs to be on many different alternatives. It shouldn't just be on one alternative. It needs to be on Section 702 of the FISA amendments. It should be on a variety of things that could make this better, whether or not FBI agents should be able to write their own warrants or whether they should be signed by judges. There's a variety of things that we need to be talking about. The Senate could simply take up the House bill and pass the House bill, but I think that's unlikely. This is an interesting article from the Boston Globe a while back, and it says what your metadata says about you. From MIT's Cesar Hidalgo, a new window on what your email habits reveal. The article is written by Abraham Reisman. As recently as a few weeks ago, metadata was an obscure term known mainly to techies and academics. Broadly defined, metadata is data about other data. For the phone company, it might be the time and length of your calls, but not the conversation itself, the context of the email. It means information such as the sender and recipient, basically everything except the message. We spoke earlier about the suspicious activity reports. These are reports that the government requires that banks send in. It adds a cost to your banking, and it's a pretty significant intrusion into the banking affairs and also into individuals' affairs. This is an article that was written by the ACLU about suspicious activity reports. Law enforcement agencies have long collected information about their routine interactions with members of the public, sometimes called field interrogation reports or stop and frisk reports. This documentation, on the one hand, provides a measure of accountability, but it also creates an opportunity for police to collect personal data of innocent people and put it into criminal intelligence files with little or no evidence of wrongdoing. As police records increasingly become automated, law enforcement agencies are increasingly seeking to mine this data. The Supreme Court established reasonable suspicion as the standard for police stops in Terry versus Ohio in 1968. This standard required suspicion supported by articulable facts, suggesting criminal activity was afoot. In the suspicious activity reports, though, these kind of programs threaten this reasonable, time-tested law enforcement standard by encouraging the police and the public to report behaviors that do not rise to reasonable suspicion. So it's one thing to say that someone's done something that rises to reasonable suspicion, but it's another to say that activity that could be perfectly normal, like withdrawing $1,000 from the bank, putting $1,000 in the bank, that somehow that is suspicion of a crime, that you should be investigated. A lot of this stuff has gotten really, really out of control. And it's one of the things that actually the newspapers have done a pretty good job at reporting some of the stuff. Not necessarily on the suspicious activity reports, but on some of the other confiscation of people's assets without really evidence of a crime, but maybe evidence of that they just have cash. You can be driving down the road in D.C. and make an unsafe lane change, and government asks you if you've got money. You then find that the government takes it. Or the government says, well, you've got $2,000, we'll let you keep $1,000 if you sign a statement saying you won't sue us to get the other $1,000 back. Believe it or not, that's the kind of stuff that's still happening in our country. It's called civil asset forfeiture. To make it worse, we actually give a perverse incentive. We say to the local officials that if you capture money from people, that will give you a percentage of it. So the more you take, the more you get. Some people actually have shown that people actually go after things that are paid off. There was a hotel, I think up in New Jersey, the Caswell Motel. And local officials decided they'd go after it because they said, well, there been some drug dealings at the motel. Turned out that I think there were 6 people caught in the motel selling drugs out of 180,000 visits or something ridiculous. Turned out that there were other hotels that had a higher percentage of drug busts done at the hotel, but they owed money, and the Caswell Motel was completely paid off. May have been part of the decision-making process, because when the government came and seized the hotel for illegal activity, they take the hotel, they sell it, but if it's got a lien against it, the bank owns it, you don't get to sell it very easily. So theirs was paid off, and they were just going to sell it. It's a $1.5 million hotel, and then I guess the local police force is able to benefit by that. So it isn't just with our records that there's a problem. It's also with the concern for how we adjudicate justice in our country. And as we see this moving forward, I think we need to be worried about not only the way our records are collected, but we need to be concerned about justice in general. As I've traveled around the country, one of the things I've seen is that there's what I call an undercurrent of unease in our country. I traveled to Ferguson, I've traveled to Detroit, I've been to Chicago, I've been to most of our major cities, and I've also been to some of the places where there's been this anger. And I think people are angry because they don't feel like government's treating them justly. People don't like to be treated arbitrarily. In fact, there are some who have given the definition of sort of what is sort of acceptable, what is good government, what is bad government, what is good law, what is bad law, what is just, what is unjust, but whether or not it's arbitrary or not. Hayek in The Road to Serfdom talks about that arbitrariness, not having the predictability of knowing what the law will do, or that the law doesn't do the same thing to all individuals, is sort of a definition of injustice that causes people to be unhappy about the way their government treats them. My fear is that this arbitrary nature of collecting bulk records, of collecting all of our records without a significant warrant, that the problem here is going to be something that adds on to a sense of unease that is in our cities and in our country at large. What happens is that everybody's not treated exactly equal. No, people don't have the same resources to try to escape, the clutches of Big Brother when either data or information is used against them. One of the little noticed sections in the USA Freedom Act deals with the safety of maritime navigation and nuclear terrorism conventions implementation. Interestingly, there's a provision somehow in this for civil forfeiture. But I think the biggest problem with civil forfeiture is that we allow it to occur without a conviction. And I think no one should have their possessions taken to them. I think you should be innocent until proven guilty. I see the senator from Connecticut. If he has a question, I'd be happy to entertain a question without losing the floor.
Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I thank my colleague from Kentucky for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. And in the preface to that question, I'd like to make a couple of remarks, if he will yield to me for that purpose. My colleague from Kentucky, I think, has taken the floor tonight in the highest traditions of the United States Senate to make a point that should be meaningful to all of us who care about our democracy. My colleagues, including the senator from Kentucky, have made a number of important points about the danger of mass surveillance and the harms caused by bulk collection of American data. And I agree with those who have pointed out that the USA Freedom Act is a strong compromise solution for protecting American freedom and security, at the same time striking a balance between preserving our security and protecting our precious rights. And I want to highlight for the senator from Kentucky, in his very insightful remarks, as well as for my colleagues and others who are interested in this topic, a particular part of that legislation, provisions that deal with the adversarial process in the FISA court. The bulk collection program is a powerful example of why we need a stronger adversarial process. We know that bulk metadata collection is unnecessary. The President's own review group has made that clear. We also know that bulk metadata collection is un-American. This country was founded by people who rightly abhorred the general warrant and no general warrant in our history has swept up as much information about innocent Americans as the orders permitting and enabling bulk collection. Last week, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals held that bulk collection is also unauthorized by the law. More than 9 years after the government began bulk collection, we are finally told by the highest court to consider the question that the bulk collection program was never authorized by Congress. How did we get here? How did we arrive at a place where one of the most respected courts of appeals in the United States says that the executive branch of our government has been collecting data on innocent Americans without legal authority to do so, in fact, breaking the law by invading Americans' privacy? We got here because the FISA court failed its most crucial test. In May of 2006, the FISA court was asked whether the federal government could collect phone records of potentially every single American. The argument hinged on the word relevance, quote, relevance in the statute. Under the statute, the federal government can collect relevant information. The court had to decide whether relevant information means all information. That doesn't strike me as a difficult question. Does relevant information mean all information? And it didn't strike the Second Circuit Court of Appeals as a difficult question either. The Second Circuit held that the federal government's interpretation is, quote, unprecedented and unwarranted. Strong words for a court normally extraordinarily reserved and understated in its characterization of illegality by the executive branch. But the court said it unequivocally and emphatically: the government was breaking the law. Never before in the history of the nation had such a bizarre interpretation even been entertained. At the very least, you would have thought that the FISA court would recognize that its May 2006 decision was important. If this question had gone to a regular Article III court, it would have been immediately recognized as a momentous decision permitting bulk collection of data on every American. Litigants on both sides would have, in effect, pulled out all the stops in their arguments. Yet, not only did the FISA court get the question wrong, in May 2006, it appeared not even to have spotted the issue, not even have raised it and addressed it in its opinion. Of course, nobody knew it at the time because the opinion itself was kept secret, as were all of the proceedings on this issue. The FISA court upheld the government's bulk collection program, and it did so without even writing an opinion explaining its legal reasoning. Not until the program was made public, roughly 8 years later, was an opinion written, and every opinion released so far has omitted key issues or ignored key precedent. If the court had written an opinion, at least Congress would have quickly known what the court had done, not to mention the American people knowing what the court had done. But the court wrote nothing. It chose to be silent and secret. And apparently it believed that this issue merited no notice to the United States Congress. A court that could get such an important question so disastrously and desperately wrong is fundamentally broken. Now, let me be clear. I don't mean to denigrate the judges of the FISA court. Any judge, no matter how wise and well attuned to legal issues, needs to hear both sides of an argument in order to avoid mistakes. Courts make better decisions when they hear both sides. In fact, during a hearing on this issue in the Senate Judiciary Committee, I had the opportunity to ask one of the nation's foremost jurists whether she could do her job without hearing from both sides of an argument, and she was quite clear No, she could not. Adversarial briefing, she explained, is essential to good decision-making. We know as much from our own everyday lives. We make better decisions when we know the argument against what we're going to do, what we're going to think, what we're going to say. It's the genius of the American system of jurisprudence that judges listen to both sides in open court before they make a decision, and their rulings are public, they are evaluated and judged themselves. 9 years after the FISA court's ruling in May of 2006, we continue to wrestle with the impact of the court's grievous, egregious error. But we cannot simply fix the mistake without fixing the court. We can't fix the system without remedying the process, because that process is so broken it will make more mistakes, not only predictable, but inevitable. As technology evolves, we cannot say with certainty what the next big privacy issue will be. In 2006, the FISA court decided whether government can collect all of our phone records. In 2020, the government will have some new means of surveillance, and they'll want to try it. In 2030, we'll have another. We need a FISA court that we can trust to get the question right. Trust is at issue here. Confidence in the integrity of the judicial system that authorizes surveillance of Americans' private lives. We need a FISA court that operates transparently, openly, accountability, a court that operates in secret, hears only the views of the government, and faces only minimal appellate review, and therefore cannot be trusted to pass the next big test. The USA Freedom Act would fix this systematic problem. It would demand, under certain circumstances, that the FISA court hear from both sides of the issue and explain why it is making a decision, and also explain why it has decided not to hear both sides if it chooses to do so. It would bring transparency to the FISA court decision, requiring them to be released unless there's good reason not to release them. It preserves the confidentiality of the court where necessary, but it also protects the fundamental, deeply rooted sense of American justice that an adversarial, open process is important, indeed essential to democracy. And it would provide some appellate review, some form of review by an appellate court, so that if mistakes are made, they are more likely to be caught and stopped before they result in fundamental invasion of private rights. In short, the USA Freedom Act will make the FISA court look more like the courts that Americans deal with in other walks of life, more like the courts that they know when they're litigants, when they're spectators, more like the courts that our founders anticipated. What would they have thought about a court that hears cases in secret, makes secret decisions, operates in secret, issues secret rulings that get it wrong? They would have thought, that sounds a lot like the Star Chamber. That sounds a lot like the so-called courts that caused our rebellion. This change will help ensure that we are not back in this chamber 9 years from now debating the next mass surveillance program that started without Congress actually authorizing it, as did metadata collection. It will help ensure that strictures of our Constitution are obeyed in spirit and letter, and it will help ensure that programs designed to keep Americans safe can command the respect and trust they need to be effective. We need those programs. National security must be preserved and protected, but we need not sacrifice fundamental rights in the process. Unless and until this essential reform is enacted, along with the other essential reforms contained in the USA Freedom Act, I will oppose any reauthorization of Section 215. So the question that I asked my colleague from Kentucky, and the point that I think he has made so powerfully and eloquently, relates to this essential feature of our American jurisprudence system. Are not open adversarial courts essential to the trust and confidence of the American people? And do we not need that kind of fundamental reform in order to preserve our basic liberties? I asked this question of my colleague and friend from Kentucky because I think that his debate on the floor of this Senate tonight raises fundamental issues that need to be discussed and addressed. And I thank him for the opportunity to ask this question and address this body. Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think one of the points that you were making through the question was about the whole idea of relevance, which I think is sort of an amazing thing. And the quote from the Privacy and Civil Liberties Commission, I think, is just really hits a nail on the head, that they cannot be regarded as relevant to any FBI investigation as required by the statute without redefining the word relevant in a manner that is circular, unlimited in scope, and out of step with the case law. The interesting thing is that we want a body that works a little more like a court. And I know you've been a big advocate of the special, having a special advocate and trying to make it more like a courtroom. And I think you can only get to truth if you have people on both sides. If you have people on one side, it's an inevitability that the truth is going to be lost and you're going to list in one direction. But I think that would be a huge step forward. But it does boggle the mind that we can have them arguing that this is relevant to an investigation that has not yet occurred. Because we're collecting data and then we're going to mine it some other time for some investigation. So it couldn't be relevant to an investigation because there is not yet an investigation when they're collecting the data. And that no FISA court seemed to question that concerns me about whether or not it's a very good kind of undertaking at finding the truth. And so I think you're exactly right. And I think that there are things that we could definitely do to make it better. But I think the bottom line is we shouldn't be collecting bulk data on people who are not suspected of a crime. One of the sections of the PATRIOT Act that doesn't get quite as much discussion is Section 213. And this is the sneak and peek section, and it's not up for renewal. But it's something that also shows that how we've really gone awry on this. Radley Balco has written about this in the Washington Post. And it's how something starts out just a little bit at a time and grows bigger and bigger and bigger. So in 2001 to 2003, law enforcement only did 47 sneak and peek searches. The 2010 report, though, said it was up to 3,970. But then now we're 3 years later, and in 2013, there's 11,129 sneak and peek searches, an increase of over 7,000 requests. Exactly what privacy advocates argued in 2001 would happen. And then the interesting thing is when you look to see who exactly are we arresting through these sneak and peek warrants that were intended to be a lower standard so you could catch terrorists, well, we're going after drug dealers. So in essence, we've gone ahead and changed from a constitutional standard to catch drug dealers down to a terrorist standard, which is a lower standard. To make matters worse, there are accusations and implications from data that maybe the war on drugs has a racial or a disproportionate racial outcome. And so I think it's concerning that we're actually not using a constitutional standard, but a lower standard. Bradley Balco writes in an article from 2014 in the Washington Post, he says, Washington establishment types are often dismissive and derisive of the idea that members of Congress should actually be required to read legislation before voting on it, or at the very least be given the time to read it. There's also a lot of beltway scorn for the demands that bills be concise, limited in scope, and open for public comment in their final form for days or weeks before they're voted on. If you're looking for evidence showing why the smug consensus is wrong, here is Exhibit A, talking about the sneak and peek and how if they'd have known what was in it, we would have known in advance that it wasn't really going to end up being used for terrorists. It ended up being used for domestic crime. This is also an argument against rashly legislating in a time of crisis. On September 11th, the federal government failed in most important and basic responsibility to protect us from an attack. We responded by quickly giving the federal government that failed us a host of new powers. Assume that any power you grant to the federal government to fight terrorism will inevitably be used in other contexts. Assume that the primary other context will be to fight the war on drugs. Here's an example just from this month. I happen to believe that the drug war is illegitimate. I think fighting terrorism is an entirely legitimate function of government. I also think that in theory there are some powers the federal government should have for terrorism investigations that I'm not comfortable granting it in more traditional criminal investigations. But I have zero confidence that there's any way to grant those powers in a way that will limit their use to terrorism. Law and order politicians, and many, but not all law enforcement and national security officials, see the Bill of Rights not as the foundation of a free society, but as an obstacle that prevents them from doing their jobs. Keep this in mind when they use a national emergency to argue for exceptions to the Bill of Rights. When critics point out the ways of a new law might be abused, supporters of the law often accuse those critics of being cynical. They say we should have more faith in the judgment and propriety of public officials. Always assume that when a law grants new powers to the government, that law will be interpreted in the vaguest, most expansive, most pro-government manner imaginable. If that doesn't happen, good. But why take the risk? Why leave open the possibility? Better to write laws narrowly, restrictively, and with explicit safeguards against abuse. Of the 11,000 sneak and peek warrants that were issued, 51 were used for terrorism. We lowered the constitutional standard, but we ended up using it for domestic crime, not for terrorism. This is happening in other forms. There's something that folks are calling parallel construction. This is an article from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Hani Fakouri. The DEA and NSA team up to share intelligence, leading to secret use of surveillance in ordinary domestic crime. Add the IRS to the list of federal agencies obtaining information from NSA surveillance. Reuters reported